Hey guys, it is our first reteach session of 2020, and we are going to go over some of the most missed topics from our early Republic assessment. We took this assessment the week before winter holiday. So if you are wanting to complete a retest for this test, you need to watch the video and then choose one of the following times on this slide to come in and take your test. It will be a written SAQ format test. Okay, so really the only big topics that we noticed that you guys were struggling with were domestic policies of our first three presidents and formation of political parties. So we're going to start with domestic policies, and it seems that George Washington's domestic policies were the ones you guys struggled the most with. So I'm just going to go real quick through a reteach of George Washington's domestic policies, starting with the Judiciary Act of 1789. And the main thing that this act did was to set up a federal court system. And that should be pretty easy to remember because you see the word judiciary and you're thinking court systems already. But basically, this sets up the Supreme Court as the highest court in the country. And then it also allows there to be federal courts all across our country in addition to the Supreme Court. So for example, right here in San Antonio, Texas, we have a federal court because of the original formation of the Judiciary Act by George Washington. Probably one of the most important parts of Washington's presidency was actually done by his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the creation of a financial plan to stabilize the U.S. economy. So you will remember there are three main parts to Hamilton's financial plan. So we're just going to go through those real quick. Number one, the national government is going to assume all debts, both state debts and national debts. And remember why we have debt. This is right after the end of the American Revolution, and each state had different amounts of debt. For example, the state of Massachusetts, where Boston is, probably had more debt than someplace like, let's say, North Carolina, because of their involvement in the American Revolution. And so the states kept arguing who was going to pay the debts off, and Hamilton said, let's stop arguing about it. I'm just going to make sure the federal government pays off all of the debts for all the states. Number two, we are going to be collecting taxes and doing all these things, so Hamilton decided that then we needed to create a national bank. This was, of course, controversial because some people told Hamilton, you can't do that, the Constitution doesn't give you the power to do that, and he used the whole concept of what is necessary and proper. So he says, if I have to collect taxes, then it is necessary and proper for me also to put a bank in place in order to store these taxes and issue money. And then number three, the third part of his financial plan was protective tariffs. And remember, the whole point of protective tariffs is to convince people to buy American-made goods, American-manufactured goods. Typically, the American manufactured goods were actually more expensive than those that were imported. So in order to convince people to buy those American goods, import taxes or protective tariffs were put on those goods coming into the country. The North, the Federalists, really loved this idea, of course, because that's where the industry primarily was. The South was still purchasing a lot of goods that were imported, and they did not like protective tariffs. And so that would be the Democratic Republicans. The Whiskey Rebellion was a domestic policy of George Washington that you guys particularly struggled with. So let's review the events of that real quick. So remember that George Washington comes into the presidency, and as we just said with the Alexander Hamilton stuff, the economy is not doing so well. So Washington and Hamilton try to come up with some ways creatively to make money, and one of the ways that they do that is by taxing whiskey. This particularly angers the Pennsylvania farmers because they grow grain. Grain is the main ingredient of whiskey. So if whiskey is taxed, then less people will buy whiskey, less people will be making whiskey, which means they're selling less grain. And so they didn't think that they should have to pay this tax. They didn't think that George Washington should be able to enforce such a tax. And so they challenged him. They said, We are going to attack your tax collectors. We are not going to pay this tax until you do something about it. We are going to ignore this law. And to show the strength of the federal government, George Washington brings in 13,000 troops and stops the rebellion. Okay, so lastly, the other topic you guys struggled with was the formation of political parties. Primarily why the political parties formed, what they were disagreeing about, and so forth. So remember, we have our two political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. I've put the little chart there just to review and refresh your memory. But remember, as you look through this chart, that the main thing that you keep coming back to with these political parties is federal power. The Democratic Republicans in the South want stronger state governments. They don't want the federal government to be able to boss them around quite as much, probably mostly due to slavery, of course. The Federalist Party in the North favored a much stronger central government and a more loose interpretation of the Constitution in order to use implied powers to justify national banks and things like that.